Heading south of the Mason-Dixon, this is the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. Here is your host, Brian McClanahan.
Welcome back to the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. This is your host, Brian McClanahan, and this is episode 309, covering the week of May 16th through May 20th, 2022. Glad to have you back on the program. Very glad to be here. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter, like our Gab page, and subscribe to our YouTube page. You can find all those social media accounts at our webpage, abbevilleinstitute.org. That's ABBEVILLE institute.org. While you're there, give us that email address. We'll give you a free ebook, Exploring the Southern Tradition. It's a great book written by 20 Abbeville Institute scholars. You want to get it free of charge just for giving us that email address, and that's how we keep in contact with you. You get our daily dose of Dixie Monday through Friday, which keeps you up to date on all that we're doing at the Institute. Also, through that email address, we let you know about conferences. We let you know about our upcoming Zoom webinars. All those things are important for us. It's our contact for you. In the age of social media, blacklisting, and other things, the email address is one way we can always stay in contact with you. Also, while you're at abbevilleinstitute.org, consider a donation to the Institute. We are a nonprofit organization, so your donation is tax deductible to the full extent of the law. So if you like what we do, if you like our podcast, our website, our conferences, all the things we do, our books, right, the Abbeville Institute Press, consider a tax deductible donation to the Abbeville Institute. Also, click on the shop tab, get our logo and all kinds of great stuff. It's high quality embroidered logo, so it's not going to wash off in the washing machine or have a problem in the dryer, so that logo will stay with you. We've got it on hats, golf shirts, golf towels, all kinds of cool stuff. Fleece jackets, I know it's summer, but maybe preparing for the fall and winter. It'll be here before we know it again. So consider that as well. As always, share our material around on social media. We're not on Facebook, but if you do like our articles, make sure they get on Facebook. I mean, they can't stop that. So make sure that we've got our material out there. And we appreciate all of your contributions, all the things you do for us, all the things you do to help us. Also, download our free mobile app. That's a great thing. It's off the website as well. Rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. Do anything you can to let people know you like the podcast, you like the Institute, you like what we're doing to explore what's true and valuable in the Southern tradition. And we appreciate all of your support. All right, let's talk about the week. We had some interesting stuff this week, and I think one of the themes that something we talk about quite a bit, of course, is this idea of quote-unquote national unity. And what is the nation? There were certainly nationalists in the South. George Washington was a nationalist. Robert E. Lee's father, Light Horse Harry Lee, was a nationalist. There were nationalists, and I could actually make a case, John C. Calhoun was a nationalist. You can make a case that Southerners were the true nationalists in America, and how can I say that? Well, because Southerners believed in the original Union. They believed in a real union, a real nation, so to speak, of a union that benefited all and burdened all equally, that wasn't dominated by one section over the other. Calhoun's entire position on the concurrent majority, on having a negative, on having a minority negative, in his mind would produce a real union, a real national government. It would be something that would allow for the separate interests in the United States to check the power of a numerical majority, which he considered to be tyranny. You can get 50 plus 1%, and you've got a majority, and that can run roughshod over the rest. And so when you go back and you look at the antebellum period, and you examine things like Daniel Webster's speeches, or the speeches that were made in favor of the Union during the 1830s, you find that what New Englanders really wanted was simply a northern-dominated section. It's why they used the slavery issue, because they knew it could drive a wedge between the West and the South. The West and the South were certainly unified over economic reasons. I mean, they were both agricultural sections. The West wanted federally funded internal improvements, and Calhoun would talk about this. And in fact, at one point he said, look, let's give it to them. Let's the South give them these internal improvements because it'll keep them away from these New England, eastern state economic interests, industrialization, banking, and other things. It will break that alliance. And so we are able to maintain this agricultural federal republic. But at the end of the day, this was something that people talked about. A real union. Calhoun always said he was a union man. Washington's insistence on avoiding factions was out of his desire to maintain a union. The only reason some people in Virginia, and of course also New York and other states at the time, but in 1788 voted to ratify the Constitution is because they were concerned about the effects of disunion. They didn't want a situation where you had 13 independent states because they thought that would open up the United States or these separate states to conquest by the British or the French, or take your pick. So that was part of their desire to ensure that we had a real union in the United States. Now, fast forward to 1861, and what we see in 1861 is a complete distortion of what that union really meant. It was Abraham Lincoln creating an entirely new union. It was the Republican Party creating an entirely new union in 1861. And that new union was going to be dominated by a quote-unquote national government. A national government that was based on numerical majority and king numbers, as John Randolph called it. The thing that Calhoun feared the most in his disquisition and discourse. And of course, all of his speeches leading up to that point too, anytime he talked about the check on the center, it was always about thwarting this idea of a numerical majority through democracy. Now, Calhoun wasn't anti-democracy. He certainly didn't mind democracy in certain ways, certain levels of government, for example, and he didn't say anything about it in the House of Representatives. But what he didn't want, ever, was the House to be the model for the entire U.S. government. And so when you look at what happens in 1861 to 65, you have a Congress, a House, and a Senate that becomes the dominant part of the general government. And the Senate doesn't really represent the states anymore. The Senate just becomes another arm of quote-unquote democracy. This is exactly what the progressives really want. They want a situation where the Senate doesn't represent the states, hence the 17th Amendment. They want a situation where king numbers controls everything, hence the National Popular Vote Initiative, which would eliminate the Electoral College. They, in fact, openly talk about abolishing the Senate overall, right? Just having the House of Representatives be dominant in government, because they know they have king numbers. And when you have king numbers, you can get anything you want through. What they really don't want is any check on their power. It's all about power. It was all about power in the 1860s. It was all about power for the North in the 1840s, 50s, 30s. You go back to that particular period of time, this is what it's about. It's about political power. It always is about political power. And I think that's what we miss in all of this. We can get wrapped up in all these different issues, but it really comes down to is one group of people, one faction, clamoring for power over the other. And if they can get the majority in any way, they're going to use that majority to ensure that their power is absolute and that nothing can stop it. This is where Calhoun's advocacy of the current concurrent majority and these checks on power was so prescient about what would happen in America in the future. If you go back and read any of that stuff, Calhoun was certainly aware of what was going to happen. And we've seen it. It's there. So when we talk about these issues like national unity, it's a mirage. And Boyd Cathy wrote a great piece on that on Tuesday. In fact, it was titled, "National Unity is a Mirage." There's no such thing anymore. And you could actually say that there really wasn't ever such a thing in America as national unity. But certainly since the 1860s, we've had a mirage of national unity. Now, the one period of time, you could say, in American history where Americans were generally all in lockstep with each other was after the United States entered World War II. Now, before that point, that wasn't the case. But after that point, for about 4 years, Americans certainly were in lockstep over defeating the Nazis, defeating the Japanese and the Italians in World War II. There was a great spirit of national unity at that point. And people, what's really strange about that, because of the baby boomers, I think, and because of the World War II generation, which is now dying out, but people tend to believe that that was the real America, that everything else was the exception, when in fact the opposite is true. You can even go back to the 1860s. We didn't have national unity in the 1860s. We had a president that received less than 40% of the popular vote, while the Republican Party would have probably won the 1860 presidential election anyways, even had the Democrats stayed united because of the Electoral College, by the way. We don't know that, but it might have been very, very close. We still didn't have national unity. You had a large segment of the population, 60% of the population, in fact, that was against the Republican Party. And even if you look in the North, in 1864, when you don't have the South voting in that election, Lincoln only got 55% of the vote. And that probably there was some fraud in that. There's a book by Jonathan White on the military vote and how there was a tremendous amount of fraud in the 1864 presidential election. Voter fraud is not new. So Lincoln really was still a minority president. Now, you can say, well, isn't Calhoun interested in the minority? Yes, he would be. But when you have a situation where the minority is getting there through fraud, and there is no check on anything, right? I mean, and of course, using the sword and other things to enforce a national will, that's a problem. You know, the Republicans had made it to where there was really no opposition in the Congress, particularly with things like the Ironclad Oath, which was an embarrassment for the Senate. But there were other steps taken in the 1860s to ensure that the Republican majority would stay ascendant. This was their goal in Reconstruction. Well, how do you do that? You disfranchise a certain part of the population and you enfranchise another part of the population who you know are going to vote for you. And so you win every election. This is the only reason Grant was elected in 1868, because white Southerners couldn't vote. And of course, you had a large number of white Southerners couldn't vote who would vote Democrat. And you had enfranchised a large number of former slaves who were going to vote Republican. So you ensure that you win the 1868 election through fraud. That's the thing that people don't realize. Fraud again in 1868. So the Republicans were always interested in their own power. There's no national unity here. We have been a disunited United States in terms of culture, traditions, views on government. And you can say one or the other it depends on where you are, which one you think is better. But regardless, this takes into account the idea of a federal republic. The whole point of the federal republic was to absorb these differences and have a central authority with such limited powers that the states would ensure that their political culture was represented. The central authority could regulate trade, and the central authority could tax, it could defend the states, right? This is the point. That was essentially the Dominion theory that was there before the war, and they simply wanted to make sure that we had that for the central authority in the United States. Now, there were those that wanted to have the House of Representatives be all-powerful, to have a national government. They lost in 1788, but they won in the 1860s. And so when you talk about national unity and you look at all the differences in the United States, we can't have national unity. We've never had national unity. And the states were there to ensure, and the local governments were there to ensure that these differences could be maintained. And so that's what, Boyd Cathey's piece is really all about at its core. And of course, he's attacking conservatives for conserving nothing. And he brings up the great quote by R.L. Dabney, where he says, look, the modern conservative, this is being written in the late 19th century, the modern conservative conserves nothing. They're just simply going to adopt the discarded positions of the left and make them their own. And when you look at what's happening in modern America, this is what you have. This is the neoconservatives. These are the Straussians. These are the people that run around saying Lincoln's a conservative. These are the people running around saying that, Frederick Douglass and Martin Luther King are conservatives. Elizabeth Cady Stanton is conservative. I mean, these are the things that they say because they think that that's going to win them votes somehow, when it never will. But this is their firm belief. These people are conservative, quote unquote. And it's a disaster, right? It's a recipe for disaster because it's not going to win any elections. They're forgetting, Donald Trump won. And just to say, Donald Trump won because he understood what his base was in 2016. And the Straussians and the neocons don't get it. Now, of course, the Straussians, the West Coast Straussians at the Claremont, they supported Trump. But they really don't get how their positions on all these issues are actually undermining the basis of their ideology, right? I mean, if they're going to be conservative. So when you have this piece by Boyd Cathey and a point, look, the Southern tradition is the only solidly conservative, American conservative tradition in the history of the United States. It is. I mean, there are certainly Northerners who would latch onto this, and this is where you get to the debate over whether Jefferson was conservative or Hamilton was conservative. but you have a tradition that's based on the old Anglo-American order. And what I mean by the Anglo-American order, I'm talking about the Magna Carta, the English Bill of Rights, this type of federalism. Calhoun said he was conservative because he was a states' rights man. And I think that's the key to understanding all of it. If you want to be an American conservative, you have to believe in federalism. And when you believe in federalism, which is the South hung on to this longer than anyone else, you're going to have to accept that certain states do things that you don't like. And that's the hardest thing for anybody in the United States to get, right? Because if you're, say, a conservative in a state and you don't like what's going on in California, you want to make California be like you. If you're a leftist in Massachusetts, you don't like what's going on in Alabama, you've got to make Alabama be like you. And in reality, what you're doing there is creating political conflict, and you're creating more tension than needs to be there. So this is the beauty of the American political system, but people have to understand it. And that's part of the beauty of the Southern tradition. Local government, maintaining that local order. Small is beautiful. The small agrarian communities. Opposition to the welfare state, whether it's corporate or otherwise. The South was always interested in a much different kind of economy than what we're seeing in America today. Something that might have been much more humane, for example. And that's where this piece by Valerie Protopappas that we published, where she brings up a speech by Al Smith. If you don't know who Al Smith was, he was the 1928 nominee for the Democrat Party. Was defeated by Herbert Hoover. And Al Smith was a progressive. He was a Catholic. But what's interesting about Smith, by the 1930s, he became very critical of Franklin Roosevelt. And this speech is one of those where he just rips into the Roosevelt administration as being socialist. And what Valerie Protopappas has done, which I like, I mean, these are the kind of things that we forget about. Nobody remembers Al Smith today. Right? Al Smith is he's a footnote. But I like it when people go out and they dig up these old speeches that they can find. And particularly those that are critical of the centralization of power. And they point out this is something that, I mean, people have been saying these things, even in the postbellum period, for years. There were Democrats after the 1860s who were critical of excessive centralization. And Al Smith is one of them. He thought the New Deal had gone way too far, that they had betrayed federalism, and that he thought that the Roosevelt administration had become socialist. And he was right about this. I mean, this is the drift towards socialism in the United States. You have to look at it in that particular way. And so Al Smith is just letting him have it. This is a really good piece. It's long. It's 7,000 words. It's a long piece. But part of that is because Ms. Protopappas brings in all of these other parts of the speech. She quotes what Al Smith is saying and then makes a comment. In her mind, what she does is tie these things back to the 1860s. Well, why is it this way? Why did Franklin Roosevelt have this much power? Why did this thing happen? Why do we have this going on? Well, she says it's because of Lincoln. And certainly there is a turning point in the 1860s. Abraham Lincoln and the Republican regime in the 1860s and through Reconstruction is a watershed moment. It was a real revolution. Some leftists recognize this, like Eric Foner. I mean, he's open about it. This was a second revolution in America. There was a transformation of government, and it took place because the Republican Party became ascendant. Now, for years, there was a position that it was the South that was actually leading a revolution, that the North somehow maintained this original plan for government, and Lincoln was this founding father. He was tied into Jefferson. I mean, this is kind of the anti-federalist, those that study the anti-federalists like Herbert Storing would go out and say, well, I mean, Lincoln was an expression of the anti-federalists. I mean, there's nothing further from the truth. But Lincoln was the second Jefferson. And the South was committing revolution. They were the antithesis of the American position, whereas they were the heretics, whereas the North was advocating the real America. And if you read, for example, and you can follow this line of thinking through, if you read the 1619 Project, this is essentially what they're saying. Lincoln was expounding on the real America, which was the proposition nation. That would have been news to the founding generation, by the way. But this is exactly what they say. So you think you follow that line where Lincoln is the guy that saved the Union and also saved original America, and then the South becomes the Southerners become the heretics. Southerners become those that distort the American founding and what it really was. And so that's where you have this why this is good, right? Where Valerie Protopapas' piece says, okay, well, wait a second here. No, I mean, the real issue is Lincoln transforming America. Again, there are some leftists that think this, and they're open about it. But a lot of Americans don't. They think that the Union was saved. It was the original Union. The South was somehow acting in a way that was anti-American. It's actually the other way around. And so that's what we have to understand about that period of time. There is a watershed moment there, the 1860s. But we also have to understand that all this stuff was there before. And this goes back again to Calhoun. Calhoun understood that America was being transformed right before his eyes in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s. And of course, he dies in 1850. But that's exactly what's happening. And he would put it back on, not the president, not the Supreme Court, but the Congress. He said the Congress is the greatest enemy of constitutional government. They're the ones that are creating all the problems. Yeah, we can say the president is doing X, Y, and Z, but that's a symptom of the disease, which is Congress. Congress is allowing all these things to happen. In his positive good speech, one of the things that always, I think, surprises people in that speech, if you actually read it, most people don't read it. They just say, Calhoun said slavery was a positive good. They don't actually know what he said in the speech. He never defended slavery in the abstract. One, that's the first most important thing. But he also said something very remarkable in that speech. He said the Congress could abolish slavery. And, I mean, if you think about it, Southerners and Northerners would say this is impossible. Even when you get to 1861 and you have debate over the original 13th Amendment, which was the Corwin Amendment, or as Daniel Crofts calls it, the Lincoln Amendment, which would have made slavery permanent in the South. Even when you go back and look at that amendment, and you say, well, I mean, there are Southerners and Northerners saying this is not the point of this argument here. The point is the territories, right? Slavery expansion, the territories, the common property of the United States. We know that you can't abolish slavery in the South. Calhoun would have said, well, sure you can. You can do it. If Congress can pass the force bill, if Congress can pass a protective tariff, which is unconstitutional, if Congress can pass a bank, which is unconstitutional, if Congress can pass federally funded internal improvements, which are unconstitutional, why can't they abolish slavery in the states? They can do whatever they want. There's no power to check it. You see, he was already zeroing in on the unconstitutional powers of Congress. They had been passing unconstitutional legislation since 1789. So why can't they pass more unconstitutional legislation? They could do whatever they want. So this is why he always thought the states were the block in all of this stuff, that the states could just ignore these things or say this is unconstitutional. But the Congress, in his mind, because it had been proven over decades, could do whatever it wanted. The Constitution was nothing. It meant nothing if people didn't really want to adhere to it. And if there was no power to check it, which he said was, of course, to Calhoun, was always the 10th Amendment. There just needed to be some type of teeth in that amendment. But if the Congress can pass Henry Clay's American system, and he brings that up, if we can do all of these things, then Congress can do whatever they want. They can pass any legislation they want. Who's going to stop them? The president? The Supreme Court? Nah, because the president and Supreme Court didn't stop this other unconstitutional stuff. Now, maybe they can pick and choose. Maybe on this particular issue they would, or that particular issue they wouldn't. But at the end of the day, the only power that can stop these things is the states. It's the 10th Amendment. It's always been the recourse, and it's always been the thing that's allowed, at least under the design, the states to block unconstitutional legislation. But that's one thing that people don't realize about Calhoun was that position. He thought the states could do whatever they wanted. The general government could do whatever it wanted. There was no power to check it. There's no power to stop it. They can do anything it wants. And so that's where I think that, this speech by Al Smith, and then of course Valerie's discussion of it and pointing back to Lincoln is interesting, right? It's an interesting position, and anytime you can do that, if you people listening to this and want to submit articles to the website, we always take submissions. Do things like that. Find these old speeches in the postbellum period, which I find to be a more interesting time in some ways than the antebellum period. But in the postbellum period, where we're really wrestling with this new national government and what it's doing, and people are starting to say, wait a second here. What about this? What about this? That's a really interesting time period. And of course, Dabney's saying, there's no conservatives anymore. It's all gone. That's all gone. Once you destroyed the southern side of these things, it was gone. You can't have it anymore. And I think he was right about that too. So those are really interesting pieces this week. We had a nice book review of by Karen Stokes, Blacks in Gray Uniforms. This is a big controversial topic. Were there black Confederates? We've talked about it on this podcast before. You've got several books out there now. Well, the most important, it's not a very good book. In fact, it's weak in terms of its research and its overall positions, but it's the Kevin Levin book, Searching for Black Confederates. The issue that he takes there, it's all semantics. He says there were no black Confederate soldiers because the Confederacy didn't recognize black Confederate soldiers until 1865, so there were no black Confederates. Now, saying there's a black Confederate and a black soldier are two different things. There were certainly blacks that were doing soldiering activities. They weren't officially recognized soldiers. This is true until 1865. But they were doing soldiering activities, and there were blacks that supported the Confederacy. Even if there's just one, there were blacks that supported the Confederacy. But no, there was more than that. And when you get into the issue, well, these people were slaves and they didn't have free will. Well, what's a conscript, right? I mean, somebody that is forced into the Union Army or even the Southern Army. What's a conscript? Are they there by their free will? Are they not really a slave at that point to the Army? If they try to leave, they're shot. So deserters will be executed. So what is that? Is that someone who supports the Army on their free will? No, it's not. So, I mean, this is just a weak argument. There were certainly people of color. This is the Earl Imes talk that he gave at one of our summer schools years ago. There were certainly Confederates of color and people that supported the South for whatever reason. Maybe it was selfish motivation. Maybe it was they didn't want to, have something happen to them. You have people like Horace King in Columbus, Georgia, who's supplying lumber for the Confederacy, wasn't really that in favor of secession, isn't really, not a big pro Confederate government, but of course he was doing things, so that makes him, and by default, he couldn't ever say that he didn't support the Confederacy because he gave financial support to it, financial support and labor. He was free, right? So this is something that's happened. In fact, the CSS Jackson was built entirely by his labor, by his lumber. So Horace King, even though he was not in favor of secession, even though he was certainly more interested in the Union, the northern side of things, he was still by default, because of his participation for the Confederate war effort, a black Confederate. You can't get around these things, right? So, you can say, well, these people were coerced into it, they were forced, whatever, right? But they were being helped out. They were helping out the Confederacy. Now, King, interestingly enough, after the war, sued the state of Alabama for money, right? He wasn't paid. And he won. He won in court to get his money that he was due for this lumber that he was supplying to the Confederacy. But there were others that were more willing, much more open about supporting the Confederacy. This is an interesting position, and again, most of the time the left attacks on it are simply semantics. It doesn't mean that the Confederacy was in any way politically motivated by, biracialism or whatever you want to say, but certainly there's complexities to the Confederacy that people don't want to recognize, because it punches holes in their ideology, right? So that's an interesting article. Then, of course, we had this really good piece by Casey Chalk talking about, being a Southerner, an adopted Virginian, and in the Shenandoah Valley. And look, this is something that people, again, in the South, you had people that moved to the South, even in the antebellum period, that became Southerners because they simply just accepted the way of life in the South. And you still have that. The real problem with interstate migratory patterns, is that you have people coming from other parts of the United States into the South because they want the climate, they want the relaxed lifestyle, but they don't abandon the culture from where they're from, and they make it just like where they're from. That's the issue. If you don't abandon where you're from and you move to the South, well, then you become the problem. I mean, there was a nice image the other day somebody put up on social media of the CSS Hunley crew being reinterned, right? So this big parade with Confederate flags everywhere right through Charleston, you would never see that today. The mayor of Charleston would not support that in any way. But this happened, and it wasn't that long ago, 30 years. This happened, right? And people that are alive in their lifetime, you still had the city of Charleston being supportive of its Confederate heritage. And so we just don't see that. In 30 years, it's all changed. It's all gone. And that's a real travesty. You're losing part of your history and traditions when you do that. And you're saying that some people are more important than others, and some people's history is essentially forfeit. It's bad now. So, anyways, I mean, this is a nice thing, but Southerners were always welcoming to people from outside the South as long as they simply accepted being part of the South. And then, last but not least, we had a nice piece on Armistead Burt, who was the piece is Armistead Burt, a friend of Jefferson Davis, talking about the Burt house in Abbeville, South Carolina, where Davis actually spent the night. And Burt was not worried about the potential repercussions from this and allowing Verena Davis to stay there. The Burt house is still there. It still exists. It wasn't burnt down. They thought it might have been burnt down. But how? And you take this, you go back to that time, and you put yourself in that position, and how the war was lost by that point, and how shocking this would have been, how terrifying this would have been for people at that point. What's going to happen to everybody? Are we all going to be executed? Is our property going to be forfeit? I mean, this was a really uncertain time. And I don't think anybody really recognizes how stressful that would have been for many people in the South. And of course, for a lot of people now, well, they deserved it. They're traitors, but they weren't, and they didn't. So this is the human side of things. Just as if look, there are unions. I brought up the other day, I think on my own podcast, a letter from a union, a couple of Union soldiers to a family of a guy that had died of dysentery in Mississippi. And you can feel horrible for this kid. He signed up to get three meals and some money, and he ends up getting dysentery. And you feel sorry for that kid. Or the very powerful letters home from Union soldiers who were killed. I mean, these were Americans, and you can feel sorry for them and their families. Just as you can feel sorry, even if you're not pro-South, sorry for Southerners and their families and their situation. You can see the human side of all of this, and I think that's something that's lost. We've demonized, we've dehumanized, more importantly, Southerners to the point that they're just forfeit. They're nothing. They're just there to be taken down, and they're dispensable. I mean, you just get rid of them. They're not even an important part of America. They're heretics. They're traitors. And once you do that, once you dehumanize a population and a group of people, even in history, it becomes easy to tear them down. So this is why I like this little piece, because it brings that human element back in to this part of the war. All right. Hope you enjoyed this week in review at the Abbeville Institute. Until next time, good day.